Now, you've got this second big challenge, not just in the mission statement, not just of strengthening people's voices and vulnerable people's voices, but secondly, it says in order to change policies that affect their lives. Well, what do we mean by policy? What's the policy process? Now, as I understand it, so here's kind of a circle. Some people think about policy as that little black box somewhere in the government where voices and participation comes in and some policy comes out. It's the input-output. You put something in the machine and out it comes the other side. To me, the policy process is much broader than that, and therefore it has points of contestation or opportunities for influence at many levels. As I understand it, in the Voices for the Front Line, you in a way have started at the end of a policy process. You saying, how do we hold governments to account by monitoring what they're doing on disaster risk reduction policy? Okay? And that's very, very important. And in this decade particularly, there's been a growing rise of movements for civil society to hold the state to account. Accountability isn't happening just within government. We need civil society voices to hold national and international institutions to account. And that's very, very important. But I argue with donors a lot to say, why should citizens spend their time holding governments to account for policies that come out of the process if they've had no role in creating those policies in the first place? We can have very participatory monitoring of very unparticipatory policies. And I think that's not sustainable. And in fact, I'll argue the other, that in my view, in the studies that show where citizen monitoring has worked the best, is where people have felt they have had a role in creating the policies which they're later going to monitor, because then they own them. And so we can think about, and I heard you say this a number of times already in your feedback from yesterday, various points of entry into the policy process. First of all, it's about capacity and awareness. How do we help build people's awareness of their rights, about the policies of DRR, of climate change, all these kinds of issues? If people aren't aware, somebody else will speak for them, not with them. Individual awareness isn't enough. How then do people come together to take action collectively? How do you organize? I know many of you here are experts in grassroots organization, which moves from individual voice to collective forms of action outside of the state to make demands on the state, and that's very important. But increasingly we see around the world what we call spaces for co-governance, for invited participation, where citizens and civil society come together in consultations or in legally empowered frameworks to make decisions with each other. In the participation world, of course, the most famous of these models was the Porto Alegre budgeting experiment. How many people are familiar with Porto Alegre? So it's a process where budgets, which used to be made by governments, are now being made together by citizens and government officials in a combined space. And we'll come back to these spaces later. So that's another point of entry. Another point of entry is to find those people inside the government who are your champions and help them. We can spend a lot of time strengthening voice on the one side, but if we're not strengthening responsiveness on the other, raised voices will just hit brick walls. Like you said, the risk of building frustration where there's no responsiveness. And over time, we've come to see the importance of what we call working on both sides of the equation. Strengthening voices on the one side and finding the champions on the inside of the government who can help strengthen those voices from where they sit. And I can talk about that. We've been holding big networks of meetings of champions of participation inside the government who hold the doors open for civil society, and they are important allies. And then we can talk about multiple ways of holding duty bearers to account, or accountability. Now, to me, one thing I want to get this in your mind, because in a minute I'm going to ask you to discuss which of where are the best entry points for you if you're talking about strengthening the voices of people in the policy process? And you've been focusing a lot here. Are there other entry points that you're already using in your societies and in your communities? Now, how am I doing on time? Okay, let me just rush through. So, can this really be done? You know, you guys are trying something pretty exciting and pretty bold, but there are examples of where citizen action at the local and national and global level has brought about fundamental change in policy. I'm not going to talk so much about the local level, that's another conversation. Globally, there's been many global civil society networks that have made a difference. I'll come back to that after the coffee. But we've recently finished a study of successful national level change led by civil society. In the academic world, you know, academics are usually cynics. They go out and tell you how something can't happen and why what you're doing is wrong. We said, let's turn that around. Let's find where civil society made a difference and try to understand how change happened. And so we looked around the world and we came up with 8 examples of where civil society mobilization fundamentally changed national level policy in a pro-poor way. And I'm just going to run through these on your tables as a postcard, which describes this set of studies, and you can come to our webpage and download short summaries of each of them. So I'm not going to cover them all. But in the Philippines, a national campaign on land actually redistributed half the country's agricultural land. In South Africa, a national movement of a treatment action campaign actually brought to the national government, changed the national policy on HIV/AIDS, benefiting 60,000 people. In India, I think we've got a number of people from India here. The right to information law came from where? Not from outside donors or governments saying do this. It came from a grassroots movement to produce one of the strongest right to information laws in the world, much stronger than what we have in the UK. In Mexico, a campaign to reduce infant mortality. In Brazil, a right to the city campaign, which ensures the rights of people to be involved in planning and urban level. In Chile, the right to children's rights. Very interestingly, in Turkey and in Morocco both, big movements by women and others to change very repressive gender laws in those countries. And those are just 8 very quick examples in other sectors from what you're working on, where massive civil society movements and organizations help change national governments and brought in resources and change the legal frameworks. There's 3 or 4 lessons I think we can learn from these. First is, all these happened in places where there was enough democratic space for NGOs to mobilize. I think we have to accept that. I'm constantly challenged by this. They're saying, but these are in countries like India and the Philippines, and they're democracies. Yes, they are. If you don't have democratic space, then civil society has to think about different strategies. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model. But what should concern every one of us, even in some of those democracies now, is the shrinking space for civil society. As civil society has demanded more accountability from powers, there's been a pushback and increasing restricting of the space that citizens have to speak out through NGO laws, through, as you see now, the linking of militarization and humanitarian space, through a whole set of other things. So if you're talking about strengthening citizens' voices, you also have to think about what's the environment, the enabling framework that in our country that allows us to do this. Secondly, even though I talk about civil society and the importance of that, in not one of these cases did civil society do it alone. Change happened through alliances of people in the government and outside the government, of civil society and media and academics and NGOs and others.